2024 was objectively my best year on the bike to date. I had higher power numbers in training and in racing than I've ever had, and finally, I made some progress on the results sheet as well. After 2 years of finishing in my typical 16th place in the Lifetime Grand Prix, which is the premier professional off-road cycling series in the US, this year I made it up to 12th place, and while 4 places may not seem like a huge jump, any forward movement against this ever-increasing level of competition is a huge win for me. I'm sorry, I know this result does kill the meme. At first I wanted this to be a how I trained for 2024 wrap-up video, but in 2024 there was one result that stood out far above the rest, and that was my top 10 finish at the Unbound 200. I believe I was the fittest I've ever been in my entire life during the week of this race, and that's demonstrated by the 283 watt normalized power, which is over 4 watts per kilo for over 9 hours that I was able to do on race day. The training I did to get in that kind of shape is a lot of the tried and true stuff that I've been recommending on this channel for years, and some of it was far more extreme, and I'll get into all of that in this video. And hopefully by the end, you'll have a better idea of how to train yourself for an event like this. Welcome back to the channel. This video is fueled by the feed. I'm sure that if you're watching this, you're already familiar with the Unbound 200, but just in case you live under a rock that somehow has enough internet connection to load this video, the Unbound 200 is the biggest gravel race in the world and is extremely long at 200 miles or 320 kilometers. As you can imagine, it takes a hell of a lot of fitness just to complete this thing, let alone actually be competitive in it. This year, I had the best result of my career so far at Unbound with a 10th place finish. And as a side note, the exact bike and bike setup that I did this race on could be yours. Yes, the felt breed carbon that I meticulously optimized for this race is on sale now over at bicycle.com, with all proceeds from the sale going to building back my home of Western North Carolina, which was devastated by hurricane and flooding this year. The link is down in the description below. So why am I focusing on Unbound specifically? Could it have anything to do with the fact that anything on YouTube that has the word Unbound in it gets crazy views for some reason? Well, that's only part of the reason. The main reason is because for me, this is a standout once-in-a-career performance. Ugh. Have you ever seen somebody milk a 10th place finish this hard before? Now, believe it or not, I actually have won plenty of races, and I have even placed higher at Unbound with a 9th place back in 2018 when it was a completely different race and the spirit of gravel was still alive and well. But never before have I performed this well against this level of competition, which included an Olympic champion, world champion, top gravel racers from all around the world, and of course, the entire Lifetime Grand Prix field. This result was substantially above expectation for me, which is why I think it's worth examining closer. Perhaps there's something to learn by taking a look at exactly how I prepped for it. That's what I'm going to be getting into in this video, and let's not waste any more time because I have a feeling that this is going to be a long one. Training for the 2024 Unbound started in October of 2023. My last race of the 2023 season was Big Sugar on October 21st. And the first thing you do after the last race of the season is get straight back on the bike and start putting in those miles for next year. No rest for the weary, right? No, absolutely not. Probably one of the biggest mistakes that I see amateur cyclists make is just training all year long as if the next race is constantly right around the corner. Stop doing that and take a break. There is actually a physiological purpose for taking a break. There is research to show that an off-season break can allow certain hormones to reset that may have gotten out of whack during the season, like testosterone, for example, which can be suppressed after a stressful season. The same can be said for certain blood markers as well. This is a time to rid your body of all the fatigue that you have built up so you can start your training for the next year on the right foot. And if you do it correctly, then when you get back into it, your motivation should be sky high. Many people think of motivation as mental, and it certainly is, but it's also tied to your physical state. If you're having issues with motivation and that's not normally a problem for you, it could be because you are chronically fatigued. One of the symptoms of overtraining and chronic fatigue is a loss of motivation, and the remedy is rest. How long the rest period should be should depend on how fatiguing your season was, but I generally recommend 1 to 2 weeks. For me personally in 2023, I took 12 days off, so almost a full 2 weeks, and in this time, I did not ride my bike or really do any exercise at all. I did, however, have the first of 2 abscesses in my throat that would plague me this season. I will spare you the gross details of it, but I promise that this is relevant and will come back into play as I approach Unbound. After that 2-week break, I got back on the bike just doing short, easy rides at a relatively low volume of 9 to 15 hours a week for about 6 weeks. During this time, riding was mostly done in Zone 1 or Zone 2. However, I would throw in a maintenance intensity session every 2 weeks, which, to be honest, would usually just consist of me chasing some not very highly coveted KOM, which is something that I would never do in season because, to be honest with you, I just don't care that much about KOMs and I prefer to focus my efforts on actual racing. Okay, I know he pretends to never acknowledge me, but that one felt personal. The reason is just to keep it fun, and structure is not super important during this time, but also you don't want to go 2 to 3 months without doing any intensity whatsoever, because this has been shown to lead to worse performance outcomes amongst cyclists in their following season. That's the training that I'm doing on the bike during this period, but I would argue that what's more important is the training that you're doing off the bike and in the gym. Fans of this channel will probably already be well versed on the benefits of weight training for cycling, but in case you aren't, my main reason for getting in the gym in the off season has nothing to do with injury prevention or being a more well-rounded athlete or having the physique of a scrawny vegan soy boy or whatever other peripheral reasons someone might give for why cyclists should do gym work. Sure, those are great side benefits, some arguably more than others, but the reason I'm in the gym is to quite literally increase the number of watts that I'm putting through the pedals when I get on the bike. And in case you're skeptical that gym work can do that, there is a substantial amount of research at this point that all points to the fact that cyclists not only improve short duration power with lifting, but longer duration threshold efforts as well. That being said, weightlifting is primarily an off-season activity for me because my race season is stressful enough as it is and recovery needs to be prioritized, and weightlifting is always the first to go. So after nearly 9 months of no lifting, I get back into it, and as you can imagine, there's a lot of soreness, and that really makes that lower volume on the bike not only welcome, but necessary. I will lift twice a week during this period, and I will make sure that there are at least 2 days between every lifting session, because oftentimes soreness can be the worse on the second day after a lift due to delayed onset muscle soreness, or DOMS. At first, the gym sessions will be very easy. I'll be doing a low number of sets, a high number of reps, and a low amount of weight for my main lifts, which are always squat and deadlift. But as I progress, I will increase the number of sets, decrease the reps to get into the strength rep range of 4 to 6, which has shown positive results in the literature, and of course, increase the weight. For me, at the end of my weightlifting phase, I will be doing 245 pounds on squats for 4 to 6 reps and 315 pounds on trap bar deadlift for 4 to 6 reps, which will put me at a perceived exertion of 8 or 9, which means I had 1 or 2 reps in reserve. I don't ever go to failure, mainly because there is a lot of excess stress when you do that for very minimal, if any, return. In fact, there is research to suggest that going to just before failure may be just as effective for gaining strength as going to failure. The full gym routine may include a warm-up, 3 sets of squats, 2 sets of deadlifts, a set of lunges, a set of box jumps, and then finish off with some bodyweight core exercises. After nearly 2 months of training like this, I took a recovery week, which only included 3.5 hours of time on the bike and very minimal gym work, which is quite a bit less than I would normally do in a recovery week. But I did get a cold during this week, and I wanted to be completely done with that cold by the following week, when I would start my base training. And this brings us to December 25th, which is when I started my first base training phase. Personally, That's what I call a perfect Christmas gift to myself. During the base season, a number of shifts in training start to happen. The most notable of which is there is a dramatic rise in the volume of training. This rise doesn't happen all at once, but rather gradually over a period of weeks. Well, ideally. This brings me to the first mistake that I made in 2024, which was getting too excited and ramping up too fast. So starting off in late December, I do my first of three-week base training blocks, which are separated by a recovery week and should gradually increase in volume from block to block and also week to week, in an ideal world. My first block looked something like this. Now bear in mind that I chunk my training into 3 days on and 1 day off. So when I say how big these weeks are, I'm referring to 2 3-day blocks put together with 1 rest day in the middle, which adds up to 7 days. Of course, there is another rest day before the next 7 days, so to speak, making it an 8-day cycle total, meaning that what would be a 21-day or 3-week block is actually 23 days. So the numbers at the side of my training peaks or on my Strava will not perfectly represent what's coming out of my mouth. Yeah, don't worry about it, man. Fudging your stats so that your riding buddies think that you're stronger than you actually are is just part of being a cyclist. I started off with a 20-hour week, followed by a 25-hour week, followed by a 30-hour week. And that is really big to start off the year for me with a really aggressive ramp. Now, to be fair, almost all of the riding done during this period was in Zone 2 with just a maintenance intensity workout done in week 1 and week 3 with lighter gym sessions thrown in as well. And to be honest, I think this first block would have actually been completely fine if I didn't then go on to double down on this aggressive ramp rate by not giving myself nearly enough recovery afterwards. My recovery week after this period was essentially only 3 days long before I was eager to get back to training. Yeah, I know. I honestly can't believe that this far into my career and as a professional coach that I still occasionally make stupid mistakes like this. In my defense, I did feel recovered, but as I would soon learn, I was not. For the next 2 weeks, I never felt great on the bike, and I entered this weird limbo period where I would try to give myself some recovery, but never enough to actually get myself out of the hole, which is reflected in the 15-hour and 16-hour week, which is an incredibly weak week, so to speak, during my base period. Fortunately, though, I have been down this road before. I have kept myself in a recovery fatigue limbo for over a month, and I can tell you that it absolutely wreaks havoc on your performance. And the only thing that you can do when you get into it is give yourself a proper rest week, which will be a tough pill to swallow because given the training that you've been doing, you won't really feel like you deserve it. Sometimes admitting that you need rest is the hardest part of training, harder than any interval session that you could give yourself. With experience, though, this becomes easier, and that's exactly what I did, and I exited that rest week feeling refreshed and ready to start hard training again. As usually happens after a bout of overtraining, I was a bit more cautious getting back into it and didn't want to go overboard with my training load, but still managed a very solid 3 weeks in the mid 20-hour range with a rest week thrown in. Again, during this period, riding is mostly done in Zone 2 with a tempo or threshold workout thrown in once a week. These workouts don't need to be complicated by any means. They might be 4x12 minutes at 95 to 100% of FTP or some variation of that for threshold, or say 2x40 minutes at 90% of FTP for tempo or some variation of that. Some people call this sweet spot, which is absolutely fine. It doesn't really matter what you call it. This sort of training is described as pyramidal training, which, along with polarized training, has amassed quite a bit of research demonstrating its effectiveness. For those that are unfamiliar, polarized and pyramidal training is when the vast majority of training time, 80% or more, is spent at a relatively low intensity like Zone 2, and then the remaining training time is either spent at a very high intensity with polarized or a mixture of moderate and high intensity with pyramidal. I will always use one of these two methods simply because they've been proven to be the most effective, and generally as I approach racing, my training will actually get more polarized. However, as a long-distance gravel or mountain bike racer doing races like Unbound, where a lot of the race is spent at this moderate sweet spot or tempo intensity zone, my training follows more of a pyramidal approach overall. So that was the base season. To be honest, it was a little rocky and some very amateur mistakes were made, but I was coming into the season with decent enough fitness. Instead of doing regular FTP tests to monitor my progress, I actually use Exert. Exert has a feature where they will estimate your FTP at any given time. Exert is by no means a sponsor of this video in any way. This is just a feature that I like to use. After the base season, my estimated FTP according to Exert was 367 watts, which is up from the 338 that it was back in January. But when I'm really in peak shape, I have seen an FTP value as high as 380 or 5.5 watts per kilo, both based on Exert and separate testing like taking 95% of my 20-minute power. That being said, race season was already starting with Mid-South, which in the US is a very prestigious early season gravel race in Oklahoma, which happened this year on March 16th. This race went surprisingly well for me. I came to the line with the lead group of 6 in contention for the win and ended up getting 5th in the sprint. Yeah, I know, my sprint needs work, but given the caliber of the field, I would say that this was actually one of the biggest results of my career up until this point, and the reason I said it was a surprise was because I was really not expecting a breakout performance right after an imperfect base season with very few race efforts under my belt. This result was a huge boost in confidence and motivation for me, and I was hoping that it would be a sign of things to come later in the season. That being said, Mid-South was not my first big goal of the year. It was actually the Sea Otter Classic mountain bike race in California. This is the first round of the Lifetime Grand Prix, and as I alluded to at the top of the video, my Lifetime Grand Prix placing at the end of the season was my biggest goal. After recovering from Mid-South, that's what I turned my attention to, and I had about 5 weeks between these two races to prepare. During this time, gym work was cut out completely to make way for the higher intensity efforts that I would do in the lead up to racing. Once I get into what many refer to as the build part of the season, which essentially just means the lead up to racing when workouts get more race focused, I will start doing 2 high intensity workouts per week instead of just 1. On rare occasions, I will do 3 high intensity workouts, but for the most part, it's just 2, and then the rest of the time is spent at zone 2 or less. So, what did these workouts look like? Well, I would mix what I call general high intensity workouts and specific high intensity workouts. In fact, if I had a week where I'm doing 2 intensity days, one would be general and one would be specific. Examples of general might be 30-30s or a classic 4x5 minute VO2 max workout, or even some standard threshold intervals. Again, nothing groundbreaking here or overly complicated. Workouts do not need to be complicated to be effective. In fact, I would say in this case, the simpler the better. That being said, I will try to make my race-specific workouts specific to the demands of the race that I'm training for. But again, there's no need to overcomplicate this. One of my go-to workouts during this period was what I call an extended VO2 max session. Because Sea Otter is a long race with repeated 5-minute climbs throughout, I would practice that in training by doing 5-minute efforts at an intensity level that is higher than my FTP, but that I could repeat for 10 to 12 times. So a little lower than traditional VO2 max intensity. Hence the reason why it's extended. For me, this meant 400 watts for 5 minutes repeated 10 to 12 times, basically until I couldn't do them anymore, but I usually like to leave 1 in the tank in training and not completely bury myself. You want to be able to recover in a reasonable amount of time from training so that you can do it all over again in a couple of days, and going all the way into the box is not always the most conducive way to do that, despite what online motivational fitness influencers may have you believe. Another common race-specific workout for me is doing intervals at the beginning and the end of a long ride. This targets durability or one's resistance to fatigue. An example of this might be starting off with 3 or 4 5-minute VO2 max intervals in the first hour, riding at zone 2 for another couple hours, and then doing 2 more VO2 max intervals at the end of the ride. Given the duration of US gravel races, this is one that I've found to be particularly useful. I also threw in a local Southeast gravel race as a training race, which had a similar duration and effort to Sea Otter. I didn't taper or reduce my training load going into it. This was just for training. During this time, volume was reduced a little bit, going down to the low 20 hours per week instead of mid 20 hours per week. People doing shorter races may reduce their volume even more, but I didn't want to do that because what I'm training for is long races, so I need to be used to riding my bike for long periods of time. This brings us to the Sea Otter Marathon mountain bike race, and for those keeping track, my FTP during this time, according to Exert, was sitting at 368. So the needle really hasn't moved much, probably due to the fact that my CTL, or chronic training load, for those who are familiar with the Training Peaks lingo, hasn't moved from around 100. This is of course because of the drop in volume alongside the increase in intensity. Despite this, on race day at Sea Otter, I actually had some of my best power numbers ever, normalizing nearly 400 watts in the first 20 minutes and 322 watts for the entire 4+ hour race. But in typical Lifetime Grand Prix fashion, this exceptional personal performance was only good enough for a pretty typical 20th place in the race, and yes, 17th out of the Lifetime Grand Prix riders. Oh boy. You guys know what's coming, right? Enter rant about how high the level is getting in the Lifetime Grand Prix in 3, 2, 1. This has become par for the course for me in the Lifetime Grand Prix. I do a time or power output that I know would have gotten me into the top 10 in previous years, or a personal best for me in terms of raw numbers, and it's only good enough to get me the same result I've always gotten because of the rising tide of the level of competition in the Grand Prix. Essentially, if you're improving, that's only good enough to maintain, and if you're maintaining, then you're going to get shot out the back. With Sea Otter out of the way, I had 6 weeks to prepare for Unbound, and this brings us to what I imagine all of you have been waiting for, and what I think is the crux of this video, the Unbound block. If you follow me on other social media channels like my Instagram or the Wonk Bros podcast, then you know that this is something that I haven't been able to shut up about. But I haven't gone in depth on it on YouTube until now. When I got home from Sea Otter, I gave myself a couple days to fully recover before starting the block. This block was going to be a higher training load than I had ever put myself through in my entire life, so I did not want to be fatigued going into it. This meant 6 days of essentially short, easy recovery rides, or at the very most, low Zone 2 rides before starting the 15-day block on Friday, the 26th of April. The block itself included 35 hours of riding in a 7-day period, followed by 40 hours of riding in a 7-day period. This was split into 3-day chunks separated by 1 active recovery day, so there were 3 active recovery days in the entire 15-day block, which totaled about 75 hours of training. Yeah, so basically for the most part, all I did for 2 weeks was eat, sleep, and ride my bike. I wish that was an exaggeration. As you may have guessed, most of that was Zone 2. I would throw a tempo workout like a 2x30 minute at 90% of FTP in every 3rd or 4th day, making for 4 of these workouts total over the course of the block. In practice, what this looks like is doing a 5 to 7 hour ride most days for 2 weeks straight. So for anybody who knows anything about classic cycling training theory, this may seem like an absolutely wild tactic, and I was probably smoking some good shit when I dreamt up this ridiculous training block. Don't worry, dude. None of us think that you've ever smoked anything or even had any fun in your life whatsoever. Well, there's a way of training known in the literature as block periodization, and the reason it's called that is because training load is blocked together instead of being more evenly distributed as is normally done. This may come in the form of doing 5 or more high-intensity days in the first week of a training month, followed by 1 intensity day per week after that, as opposed to doing 2 intensity workouts every week like would typically be recommended. In fact, the research on block periodization all deals with block periodization with intensity and has good results to support its efficacy. But what I'm talking about is block periodization with volume, which is a bit of a leap to make given the lack of research on it, but in experimenting on it with myself in previous seasons, I've found it to work extremely well. This actually ended up getting me in very good shape for Unbound in 2023, so I doubled down on it by adding even more volume this year. So what does this kind of training week actually feel like in practice? Well, somewhat surprisingly, I actually felt more tired and run down in the first week as opposed to the second week. By the time I got to the second week, I actually felt great while riding, despite the fact that I had over 70 hours of training in my legs, and this is something that I call the stage race effect. People often assume that over the course of a stage race, you should be feeling and performing worse towards the end, but for cyclists of a certain fitness level, actually the opposite can often be true, and they can often see their highest power outputs towards the end of the race. For those who love to geek out about the numbers, I did 593 miles and 1240 TSS in the first week and 756 miles or 1623 TSS in the second. And just to make this block sound even harder than it already does, this happened to be a particularly rainy 2 weeks in Brevard, North Carolina, where I live and train. And I would say that out of the 75 hours of training that I did, probably 25 of those hours was done in the rain. Yes, I know, I'm a hairy-chested hard man. Don't let this prepubescent complexion fool you. Doing the block is actually not the hardest part, though, in my opinion, because after the block you have the recovery period, and getting this exactly right can be extremely tricky. And as I'll get into in just a minute, I had some extra challenges in this period this year. I gave myself 3 weeks to recover between the last day of the block and the day of Unbound. Now, this would not be 3 weeks of just sitting on the couch. Far from it. The plan was to do mostly recovery rides in the first week, which would actually end with Gravel Locos on Saturday, which is a 150-mile gravel race in Texas, which would be my last race-specific prep before Unbound. The second week would be a combination of recovering from that race in the beginning part of the week and getting in some high-intensity efforts towards the latter part of the week, and then we get into our taper week leading into Unbound. That was the plan. This is what actually happened. I drove 15 hours out to Texas from North Carolina, mainly so that I could bring a lot of extra stuff like spare wheels and spare bikes. And on the way out there, I started to develop a sore throat. And by the time I got there, 5 days after I had ended my Unbound block, I was in the emergency room getting another throat abscess drained. For those of you who are concerned, yes, I did get my tonsils removed this offseason, so hopefully this will not be an issue moving forward. And on top of that, tonsils weigh about 6 grams, so I did save some weight too. Hashtag marginal gains. What this meant though was that I could not do Gravel Locos, and instead of staying in Texas to heat acclimate like I planned, I drove back to North Carolina to fully recover, and this week ended up being a lot lower volume than I had anticipated. In fact, in a 7-day period, I had only ridden my bike 4 hours, which is basically nothing for me, and I took 3 days in a row completely off. Now, this was going to be a recovery week regardless, but I did not plan on giving myself this much rest. I had to go on antibiotics, which I ended up having an allergic reaction to, and I generally felt pretty awful physically, probably from coming down off the block and having a ball of pus grow in my throat and looking like I had developed leprosy in the year 2024. It is certainly possible that the block itself weakened my immune system to the point that it allowed this abscess to grow, or perhaps I would have gotten it regardless. I guess I'll never know. Needless to say, my hopes were not high for Unbound at this point. But with 2 weeks left until the race, I started training again and took it day by day to see how my body would react. As usually happens when you take a break, I felt pretty awful for the first few days, but by the time I got to the weekend before the race, I knew that I was ready to go. This week back, which was 2 weeks out from race day, was a 23-hour week, so a pretty solid week all in all, and probably more volume than I would have done if I had not done so little the week before. And honestly, I was already feeling recovered. The workout that let me know I was back in shape for the race came 8 days before race day, when I did another one of those extended VO2 max sessions where I managed 9 5-minute efforts at 400 watts with 5 minutes of recovery back to back. My record up to this point at that wattage was 10, so 9 was basically right there, and according to Exert, after that massive block, my FTP was now predicted to be well into the upper 370s. This last training week ended 7 days out from race day, and then we get into the taper week. I usually never taper more than 1 week, even before my most important races. A taper should mean a reduction in volume, but you do want to keep your intensity high. That doesn't mean every ride should be high intensity, and it doesn't mean that you should be killing yourself during these intensity rides. You more so just want to test your legs while keeping quite a bit in the tank. It's this method that's been shown in the literature to lead to the best results, and I can confirm that from my own personal racing experience. At this point in my career, I rarely, if ever, screw up a taper. So, what did that actually look like? Well, on Monday and Thursday before the race, I did 3 hours of zone 2 with some intensity thrown in, which came in the form of a handful of 30-30s on Monday and 2 4-minute VO2 efforts on Thursday, and that's it. Again, these aren't workouts per se. You're not doing them to improve your fitness. You're doing them so that you don't have flat legs on race day, and you should not be tired after these sessions. The rest of the rides in the week were short, easy rides at zone 1 or low zone 2, including the day before the race, and then we have race day, and we all know what happened there. Everything I've been rambling about over the course of this video culminated in my best day on the bike ever, both in terms of the numbers and the final result. So, what do I think went particularly right here that led to this result? I do think that the volume block is critical for Unbound, and it seems that my body responds particularly well to it. For the last 2 years, I believe I have been the fittest that I've ever been in my life, following these blocks. The second piece that I think set this year apart was not planned. I think that that forced rest following the block with my medical issues was actually a blessing in disguise. With such low training volume in that week following the block, it allowed me to fully recover and absorb the training that I had just done. And quite honestly, I didn't even feel like I needed that full 3-week period that I gave myself. This is something that I'll probably try to purposefully implement in the future. The scarier the block is, the scarier the recovery period afterwards needs to be. And yes, I use the word scary because many athletes that have the capability of training like this are scared of training this little, especially with the biggest race of their season right around the corner. Thanks for watching. If you want to implement your own high volume training blocks, I am now offering high volume block training plans on Training Peaks, which takes the guesswork out of trying to get this right on your first try. Link down in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like, subscribe, and share it with your cycling friends. I'll see you in the next one.